The Civil Rights era took place mostly between the 1950s and 1960s. Let's talk about all of the people that you should know who can be considered civil rights leaders. Early on in the Progressive era, you have Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington had the Atlanta Compromise speech where he said that African Americans could forego some social rights and get the economic ones first. He also founded the Tuskegee Institute to help students learn the skills vital for the labor force. Another person you should know about the same time is W.E.B. Du Bois. He was of the Niagara movement, believing that African Americans should be equal based upon what the Constitution actually says. He's the first president of the NAACP. In sports, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in modern-day baseball in 1947. Many other African American players and Latino players would follow. In 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for breaking a segregation law on a bus. She refused to give up her seat for somebody who was white. This inspired many African American activists to start the Montgomery bus boycott. The boycott would last for about a year and would end when the Supreme Court got rid of segregation on buses. During the bus boycott, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. became a national figure. This is because he helped to lead the boycott. Martin Luther King Jr. became known for passive resistance or nonviolence, as well as civil disobedience, which means refusing to obey an unjust law. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. would be very famous for his I Have a Dream speech with the March on Washington in August of 1963. He said that he had a dream where segregation would end and African Americans and all races could live in harmony together. He spoke in front of the Lincoln Memorial, as of course Lincoln was the great emancipator of slaves. There were other civil rights leaders who used less peaceful methods. Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers, they wanted separation from white society and blacks to create their own communities. Furthermore, Malcolm X believed in black superiority and separation as well. Buses would become a symbol of the civil rights era. In the early 1960s, there were freedom riders. This is where mostly college students, both black and white, would travel into the segregated South to protest segregation on buses. They were met with much violence and many were arrested. College students in SNCC and CORE helped to organize these types of protests. Another protest movement at this time were sit-ins. This is when African Americans would go to white-only restaurants in the South and sit at the counters until they got arrested. These types of peaceful protests would gain a lot of attention in the media around the country, and slowly but surely, public sentiment started to change. The Supreme Court also changed at this time. You need to know about Earl Warren's court between 1953 to 1969. The first most important case that you need to know about is Brown versus the Board of Education. That was when Linda Brown tried to go to a white school but was denied. However, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment protected her ability to go to any school she wanted to because separate but equal, as seen as constitutional during Plessy versus Ferguson, was inherently unequal. This court case led to integration, and later you would get integration in buses, hotels, and every other aspect of American society. The NAACP was instrumental in fighting this case, and the attorney, Thurgood Marshall, would go on to become the first African American Supreme Court justice. There are other decisions of the Warren Court that you need to know. Their decisions helped to expand rights of the accused. Mapp versus Ohio led to better searches and seizures. In addition, you have Miranda rights being needed to be read. That protects the rights of the accused in the court case of Miranda versus Arizona. In addition, lawyers need to be appointed, as seen in the Gideon versus Wainwright case. But just because the Supreme Court said that segregation ended in schools didn't mean it was so. In Little Rock, Arkansas, Governor Faubus enforced segregation laws. This led to the Little Rock 9 incident in 1957 when 9 black students were denied access to the high school. Governor Faubus sent out the Arkansas Guard. However, enforcing law was the executive branch in Dwight D. Eisenhower. He sent in the army, and segregation ended at that school. Still, there was a lot of segregation in Alabama. The governor, George Wallace, personally tried to prevent black students from attending the University of Alabama. Wallace even ran for president several times, but he lost. It would take until 1964 to get the crown jewel of the Civil Rights era passed, and that is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It made illegal discrimination against race, gender, religion, and national origin. With civil rights secured, leaders now moved toward voting rights. The 15th Amendment had been ignored for many years after Reconstruction. There was violence at polls, as well as literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and poll taxes. To protest, leaders marched from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery and were met with much violence from policemen. Many of these images triggered a lot of sympathy around the nation. Eventually, in 1965, voter discrimination was made illegal with the Voting Rights Act. A year before, poll taxes ended because of the 24th Amendment. There were long-term effects of the civil rights era. Not only did African Americans benefit, but education reform and racial justice became very important to other groups, such as those of Latin American descent. They had the Chicano movement that celebrated their culture. In addition, you had the American Indian movement, or AIM, that looked to protect the rights of Native Americans. The beginnings of the gay rights movement is also seen in the civil rights era. In 1969, at the Stonewall Inn, there was a raid by the police. They wanted to arrest gay patrons. However, those patrons fought back. The Stonewall riots led to the beginning of many gay rights organizations and rallied the LGBTQ community. As for women, there was a push to ratify an old amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment. It was set to expire, and during the 1970s, there's a push for people to approve it in states. The leader of this movement is Betty Friedan. She wrote the book The Feminine Mystique and was the president of the National Organization of Women. However, there were conservatives who were against her, such as Phyllis Schlafly. They were concerned that equal rights for women would erode the family and make them subject for the draft if there was ever a war. The amendment was never ratified. Women do get an expansion of rights at this time. With the Educational Amendments of 1972, Title IX was created. Title IX gives the same opportunities to women in schools as it does to men. Women also received the Equal Pay Act, which was supposed to bring equal pay for women. However, many studies conclude that there is indeed a gender wage gap. In 1973, the court case of Roe v. Wade protected a woman's right to choose when having an abortion. That court case would stay on the books for another 50 years. As you could see, the roots of the civil rights era could have been experienced during Reconstruction. However, it would take over 100 years to make sure those rights were long-lasting. The civil rights era didn't only affect African Americans, but it affected millions of Americans, and it's still experienced today.